Ja, voorzitter, dank u wel. Professor, ik wil u ook bedanken voor uw aanwezigheid en voor uw inleiding. Ik ben persoonlijk gecharmeerd door uw verhaal over agro-ecologie. En ik kom daar zelfs op terug. Maar vooraf wil ik eigenlijk even stilstaan bij de problematiek van de eiwittransitie. U bent uw verhaal begonnen met het probleem van aan de ene kant ondervoeding, aan de andere kant overvoeding, zwaarlijvigheid en de gevolgen voor de volksgezondheid op dat vlak. Nu, eiwittransitie is ook een probleem dat te maken heeft met onze vleesconsumptie en onze overmatige vleesconsumptie, zeg maar. En ik kom dan tot de problematiek van de soja. U bent zelf in Brazilië geweest, heb ik begrepen. En ik zou aan u willen vragen of u een visie kan ontwikkelen of een invalshoek heeft om de problematiek van de import van soja voor Europa, om dat te counteren en om te draaien en zijn er sporen aan te geven dat Europa zelf op een andere manier aan zijn voorraad eiwitten kan geraken. Ik vind dat een belangrijk probleem als we kijken naar het landbouwgebeuren op wereldschaal. En vervolgens, mijn vraag is ook, hetgeen u voorstelt, zijn ervaringen uit het zuiden, zijn ervaringen gebaseerd op kleinschalige landbouw, op familiale landbouw. Is dat zomaar over te zetten naar onze Vlaamse intensieve stedelijke landbouw? Is dat over te zetten naar het Europees landbouwmodel zoals we dat kennen en zijn grootschaligheid? Ik denk dat er sporen in zitten, maar u zegt zelf, en u bent er ook mee gestopt met te zeggen dat het conventionele landbouwmodel zoals we het nu kennen, dat het eigenlijk geen antwoord is op de toekomstige voedselvoorziening en voedselcrisis. Ik ben het daar persoonlijk met u eens. Langs de andere kant zie ik ook wel een hoop obstakels om het landbouwbeleid zoals het zich nu manifesteert, om dat om te draaien. Ik denk dat niet van vandaag op morgen gebeurd is, dat er heel wat weg in af te leggen is. Dus mijn vraag aan u is ook van, kan je dat model, of zijn er sporen of concrete tips of aandachtspunten te geven om te zeggen van oké, dit is mogelijk op Vlaamse schaal, op Europese schaal. En dan heel concreet kijk ik even naar toch een paar problemen die heel significant zijn en eigenlijk toch wel determinerend voor ons landbouwbeleid. Dat is de problematiek van de GGO's, de problematiek van de grootschalige landpacht in het zuiden, ten gunste van onze eigen voedselproductie, zeg maar. En ook een recent probleem, dat is het probleem waar Europa zich nu over buigt, ACTA en de patentbescherming voor zaden ook. Ik denk dat daar toch eigenlijk structureel remmen worden georganiseerd die de plaatselijke boer, zeker in het zuiden, en misschien op termijn ook wel hier, een serieuze pad in de korf zet en serieuze problemen zal bezorgen op het vlak van zijn eigen voedselproductie, die toch wel belangrijk is voor de toekomst. En een laatste vraag is, u heeft ook gewezen op het feit dat de landbouw afhankelijk is van de petroleum. Langs de andere kant zien we dan ook een ontwikkeling in de landbouw dat we meer moeten bezig zijn met biobrandstoffen. Biobrandstoffen vragen ook weer immense oppervlakte land. Dus eigenlijk is dat ook een evolutie die ik niet zie zitten. Ik denk dat de landbouwgronden moeten dienen voor voedselproductie en niet direct in grote schaal moeten ingezet worden voor energieproductie. Dus ik vraag ook over die biobrandstoffen of u daar een visie over heeft. Dank u.
A second set of questions were asked by Dirk Peeters, and he began by questioning, asking me about the increase in animal protein consumption. The question of consumption was until a couple of years ago, a year ago, a taboo question in international discussions. The only discussions we had, and I spent my life attending meetings on these issues, were about how to increase production. Yet, we must realize that our consumption modes are part of the global equation and that they are not sustainable, right? In Niger, the average Nigerian consumes about 10 to 11 kilograms of meat per year. We consume about 85. In China, they have now reached about 60 kilograms per year. They were consuming 20 kilograms 10 years ago. So globally, the global consumption per capita of meat is increasing very significantly. And I took my notebook because I have many data on this. And the impact on the use of land is immense, immense. 70% of the agricultural surface that is today in the world is dedicated either to pastures or to producing maize and soybean to feed animals. By 2050, if we follow the curve today, 50% of the global production of cereals will go to feeding animals. And that would be enough to feed 3.4 billion people. Right? So, reducing our consumption of meat and of protein, animal protein in general, is, in my view, quite necessary. And in fact, in the Rio Plus 20 agenda, sustainable consumption at last has been put on the agenda. So it's going to be part of the discussions. It's not taboo anymore. But it's difficult to achieve. It's difficult to achieve, first because in many developing countries, we need not to reduce animal protein consumption, but increase it for balanced diets, right? So I'm speaking here of rich countries having to question the way their diets have developed. We need a contraction convergence scenario, if you wish, in this area. And secondly, it's difficult because in many ways, the way we eat is linked to cultures, and these are difficult to change, right? So they cannot be changed by decree. But I think it's certainly part of the problem. And indeed, you mentioned, I think, Mr. Peeters, the example of Brazil, dedicating huge areas of land. The same is true, of course, for Argentina, to produce soybean for us. And this is a subsidy to our cattle industry, which feeds animals with cereals instead of having them grow on pastures. And, 1 kilogram of meat is not the other. And clearly the industrial livestock production is something that I have great reservations about, for both environmental reasons and simply because of the pressure on natural resources that is increasing. If you want data, there are plenty, and to give just one figure here, there's a famous FAO report from 2006 called Livestock's Long Shadow. Beautiful title, isn't it? Calculating that 19% of man-made greenhouse gas emissions come from livestock production, right? This takes into account deforestation to create pastures. This takes into account maize production and soy production to feed cattle. And it arrives at this conclusion that 19% of greenhouse gas emissions is for livestock production. Today, researchers have figures that are much higher. And one report estimates that livestock production amounts for 51%, more than half man-made greenhouse gas emissions. Why? Because you need to take into account the packaging of meat, the transport of meat, the conservation of meat, all the processing industry represents, right, altogether, plus pastures, deforestation, and the use of land and water for livestock production, 51% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's a huge problem. You also asked, Mr. Peeters, before turning to seeds, about biofuels. It's basically the same issue, right? Biofuels are, first of all, the ultimate export crop, right? It's a significant pressure for developing countries to abandon and less support production of food crops and switch to export crops that are used by those using the raw materials to produce biodiesel and ethanol, right? Now, from my point of view, and I'm now preparing a report on agrofuels. It's actually a meeting I'm having today at 12 on this very issue with the European Commission. The impacts, from my perspective, are at 3 levels. 1, there are serious impacts on the food prices at local level. Why? Because if a region switches to, in a significant degree, to the production of energy crops, this means that the local food production will diminish and the prices will go up. This is the reason why China, which invested a lot in biofuels production in the early years of the decade 2000, 2001, 2002, to produce ethanol from maize in particular, they phased out that program, right? It's now been frozen because they feared the impacts on the local prices of wheat, maize, if they dedicated more land to production of energy crops and if they basically reduce their production of food crops. So let's be extremely cautious because the impacts for the local populations, except the happy few who benefit from biofuels production, of course, but for all the others who are net food buyers, the impacts can be considerable. Secondly, the impacts on land are very significant. The World Bank estimates, based on a study of 400 large-scale investments in farmland that it presented in September 2010, that for 21% of these large-scale investments in farmland, the investments were for biofuels production. In other terms, land grabbing that is developing at a very rapid scale in developing countries has one as its main drivers, not just food crops for exports, but also energy crops for exports. So it's very important. And in fact, the most detailed study about land grabbing in the world today is done by a group of researchers under the Land Matrix Coalition. They estimate that since 2000, 200 million hectares of land have been subject to deals, and 71 million hectares they could confirm had been concluded and implemented. 71 million hectares. Well, you will probably be surprised to know that for 1/3 of that, at least, and according to other estimates, more than half, biofuels production was the reason why land was acquired by investors. Right? So it's a huge problem. And thirdly, and this is not the least of my concerns with respect to biofuels, biofuels production artificially stimulated in the EU today by Directive 2009/28 is one major reason why the stocks of cereals at global level have gone down and why the markets are nervous and why speculation can thrive. The food price crisis of 2008 has been attributed by the World Bank for 75% of the increases to biofuels mandates. This includes the impacts of speculation on the food prices, but speculation itself is encouraged by the literally infinite demand for raw commodities to produce biofuels that are the result of the policies in place in the US and in the EU in particular, although not only in these regions. In my view, and this is not at all a minority view, it's the view of all international agencies, it's the view, in fact, of all important actors who follow seriously this issue, biofuels should be frozen and we should not increase further their production. The only major actors who oppose this are the United States and Brazil, and I suspect that even the European Commission is now seriously re-examining the assumptions that were guiding the launch of the biofuels policy in the EU about 10 years ago. Finally, Mr. Peeters, you asked about GMOs and seed regulations. I'm preparing currently a report on GMOs, and I'm not going to take a position on this. The only context in which I expressed my views on GMOs was when I visited Mexico, where they're now introducing genetically modified versions of maize. And I'll tell you one story, which is not confidential, but is not known yet. My report about Mexico was warning Mexico about the dangers of introducing GM maize in Mexico. Why? Because Mexico is the heart of maize. It has developed many native varieties of maize that for 80% of the production of maize in Mexico work better than GM types of maize. Let me briefly explain this. Genetically modified crops can be good in terms of increasing yields under certain conditions. But in many local agroecological contexts, the local varieties perform better, And since, in addition, these local varieties are free to use by farmers, they do not place the farmers on under the dependence of expensive technologies that are owned by other companies, right? So in Mexico, in 80% of the regions where maize is produced, local land races, right, the native varieties of maize, work better. And so I told the Mexican government, look, introducing GM maize means that these local varieties could be threatened, right, because maize is an extremely promiscuous crop, right? If you plant maize here, you know that 10 miles away, it can pollute the fields, right? So, and I told the Mexican government also that by disseminating GM maize, they would become dependent on one single company, which happens to be based in the United States, Monsanto. Was this critical of the Mexican government's position? Absolutely it was. And then I met with them in Geneva. I met with the chief scientists of the agricultural department there. And he told me, look, my mandate is to say your report cannot be accepted on that point. But I tell you as a scientist, you are right. Right? There is now a greater realization that for at least that country, it may be a very serious risk that they are taking, and the Mexican government is now aware that this risk is a serious one. I'm not saying more, and I believe basically that even though GM crops may have worked in certain regions for the benefit of some producers, it is not necessarily the best solution for many others and in many other contexts. Seed regulations, let me just say this. Agrobiodiversity is vital to preserve and to be supported. Why? Because diversity in genetic materials we can use is absolutely key to prepare the future because of the uncertainty of the future. Right? I prepared a report, Mr. Peeters, on seed policies, including discussing the situation in the EU. And my message was we should do two things. We should support access to improve varieties of seeds to farmers who want this, and we should support local varieties of seeds that are gradually being crowded out by the introduction of high-yielding varieties in many developing countries. And for reasons I explained